played the game of life?
Here's a picture of the board game. It's the box top of that game, and you probably will recognize it. Maybe you've played it. It's a good family game. It gives children an idea of what to expect in life as life goes along. I think it also kind of teaches a few good values and lessons along the way. Our grandchildren have enjoyed playing this game with us. Those games that we've played with them has inspired an idea for a sermon series for me. So for the next 7 weeks, I will address some of the crossroads and some of the milestones and some of the decisions we are faced with as we make our way through life, and it will be based somewhat on this game. Parts of the sermon will be directed to our teenagers, and parts of it will be applied to all of us. I will ask each Sunday one or more of our teens to join me up on stage and to help me kick off each week's sermon. For that matter, I have set aside some rows here for our teenagers to sit in. The first 3 rows are reserved just for teens. If some of you want to come up and sit here and join the rest of them, you're welcome to do so at this time. It looks like most of them are here anyway, but if you want to come up and join the rest of the teenagers, come forward now. And I have asked our youngest granddaughter, Faith, to help me introduce the series with you today. So Faith, will you join me on stage? You're excited about this, aren't you? There's your microphone. All right. When Faith was about 8 years old, she and I played this game one afternoon, and at the start of the game, if you have ever played it, you have to make a decision on which path you're going to choose to start. There's either the college path or the career path. You get right into a job right out of high school. And so as we got lined up our little cards with our little people inside of them, I asked Faith which path she wanted to take, the college path or the career path. And she said,
college.
And I said, Faith, I'm so proud of you. That's wonderful. I wanted to stress the value of a good education and where it can take you in life. Then I asked her which college she thought she might want to attend. And she replied,
Yale.
Yale. I said, that's amazing, Faith. I wanted to continue to reaffirm this newly acquired value of hers. I said, Yale is a prestigious university. That will look great on a resume. And then with her sweet-looking face, she looked at me and then she said,
and you're going to community college.
She's going to Yale and I'm going to community college. I had just been education shamed by an 8-year-old. And so that built something up in me. I was going to crush her in this game. I would show her that someone with a community college degree could beat somebody from Yale. And so we made our way around the board, competing with one another, collecting our salaries and making choices that would benefit us and making acquisitions of stock or whatever other investment opportunities and collecting life tiles. And at the end of the game, we added up and valued what our assets were, what our estate was, and she beat me. And I thought, if only I had gone to a better university. Okay, Faith, let's get this game started. I'll take the microphone back for the moment, and you go over and put yourself in the car. There you go. It's pink since you're a lady. You put yourself in the driver's seat, right? Okay, and then you come and you spin on the spinner board to see how far you advance on your first spin. 4 spots. Okay, go ahead and move your car the 4 spaces that you just spun. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Very good. And you landed on a life tile space. Here is your life tile. So you go ahead and read that to us.
God has a plan for you.
God has a plan for you. That is going to be what we will discuss today. God has a plan for your life. Okay, Faith, you can go ahead and return to your seat. Wait a minute. What did you just pass? Payday. Right, you get a payday. There you go. Good catch. Life is filled with difficult choices, as the game teaches us. At various junctures, we have to make choices on what we will do, where we will go. And I think the game kind of teaches us that about life. The first choice that we have to make as we begin the game, as I mentioned a moment ago, is to either go to college or to start a career right out of high school. Each player starts the game by being given $10,000 and a car. What? Someone obviously didn't play by the rules when I started out in life. Nobody gave me $10,000 to start right out of high school. We did buy a second car when I got my driver's permit, but it was a family car. My mother and I both drove it as was needed, and when I left for college, that car stayed at home. I didn't have my own car until I was able to earn enough money to buy one. Teenagers, real life is not exactly like this game. Unfortunately, you're going to have to get used to that idea. Here's another example of that truth. Here's a picture of the starting point of the game. Now, you're not going to be able to read the squares from where you are. They're even a little blurry. It's not a great picture. But you can see that taking the college track is a lot longer than the one where you start your career right out of high school. I'll highlight a few of the spaces you could land on if you take the college path. There are a couple places you could land on that would you would acquire money. And you could, if you get the right spins and the right number, that you could make $25,000 while you are attending college. And then you'll notice that 4 of those squares have life tile markers on the bottom of them. The life tiles are valued at either between $50,000 and $300,000. So it's entirely possible, if you land on the right spaces before you get to the place where you graduate from college, that you could make $500,000 while you were going to school. Teens, that never happens. Don't expect that in real life. And then, as you start your career, you've graduated from college and you start your job search and your career. If you went on the college track, you are given a choice of 3 options that you can choose from for your salary. Where was that when I applied for my first ministry? Okay, Mr. Brown, you've accepted the position. We're glad to have you as our minister. Now you can choose your own salary. You can make either $30,000 a year or $50,000 a year or $75,000 a year. Which would you prefer? I'll have to pray about that. Never happened to me. Now, if on the other hand you take the career track, you notice it's much shorter, but you also notice that before you even begin the game, you get a payday. And in fact, on your first spin, there's a 70% likelihood that you will hit a second payday. And so, if you take the career track, basically what happens is you get paid twice before you even start your job. Don't think that that's going to be the way life is. It doesn't work out that way. Real life is more difficult. Real life involves making tough decisions. In the game, you sometimes come to a fork in the road. And you look at the spaces when you spin and you count out, if I go this way, where will I land and what will I pass? If I go this way, where will I land and what will I pass? So that you can make the wisest choice. Well, life is kind of like that, but not exactly. We often metaphorically come to a fork in the road and we must choose which path to take. We do our best to look down each path and imagine where it might lead and what might be the consequences of taking each of those paths, and then we make our choice and we do the best that we can. Sometimes you will be forced with a decision and it will be hard to decide. Sometimes you just have to go with it. You just have to make a decision and go with it and not look back and just trust that God will provide for you and God will lead you along the way. Life is about making tough choices. Here's my best advice to all of us. When we want to make the best choice of the path that we should take, always choose God's path. I want you especially to know this, but I want all of us to understand that God has a plan for your life. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, we read these words, "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." We're going to leave that slide up for just a couple of minutes. This tells us that God chose us as his people. He chose us to be a royal priesthood. He chose us to be a kind of an intermediary between God and the rest of the people in the world who do not know him. He chose us to be a holy nation. That word holy means set apart for God's specific purposes. We have a specific role in God's kingdom. That next phrase tells us that we belong to God for a purpose, and that purpose is to declare his praises in our world. Now, that's a general purpose for all Christians, that we are all a chosen people. We are all a royal priesthood, a holy nation. We all belong to God and have the purpose of testifying to him, of him in our world. But there is also a specific purpose that God has for each of us. Your life is a divinely given gift with a special purpose. One that is specific to you. A purpose for which you have been created, oftentimes differently than other people. In Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4 and 5, and then verse 11, in the literal version, it says, "He chose us in him before the foundation of the world to be holy," set apart for his purposes, "and unblemished before him. In love, he foreordained us to the adoption of sons through Jesus Christ to himself according to his good pleasure, the good pleasure of his will." And then verse 11 tells us that he foreordained us according to the purpose of him who is working all things according to the counsel of his will. We're going to leave this slide up for a couple of minutes as well. This tells us that God, in the wording of this translation, foreordained us. That means we have been predetermined in advance by God, ordained in advance. You might be familiar with that concept of ordination if you've ever been to a service in which a young man graduating from seminary is being ordained into the ministry. A group of elders perhaps lay their hands upon him, and they pray over him, and he is set apart to go into some kind of full-time ministry, service of God, maybe as a pastor of a church or a missionary or a youth minister or some other capacity. Ordained, set apart for God's service. We have been foreordained. God determined in advance. Now, if you're familiar with this passage in other translations, the word foreordained is used, another word is used, and it's predestined. We'll come back to that thought in just a moment. What this tells us is that we have been ordained in advance by God for two things. The first paragraph is that it's been ordained in advance that we would be saved through the sacrifice of Jesus. And the second paragraph says that it was foreordained for us that we would live according to his purposes and serve those purposes. Now, we can either accept or reject that ordination of God. The reason I chose the literal version instead of one of the others because I didn't want to use the word predestined. And the reason for that is because when some people read that word, they think that God has set in stone before we were even born what would become of us, and we have no say about that. Classic Calvinistic predestination teaches that God chose some to be saved and some to be condemned, and there's nothing we can do to change if we are in one group or another. That's bad theology. It is not biblical. We are free will moral agents, and we always have the right to choose. We can either accept or reject God's plan, God's path for us. He has a path chosen for us, and He wants us to take that path. He wants us to fulfill the purposes that He intends for our lives to live out. And that purpose, His purpose for our life, can be known. We can figure out pretty much what God intended for us, what God created us to do, what role God intends for us to live out in His kingdom by the way that He created us, by the strengths and the abilities that He gave us, by the way that we are wired. We're all different from one another. Some of us have a strength in one area and some of us in another. Success is finding our fit in God's kingdom, our role, by the way that He gifted us. If we try to serve in some way that we are not gifted or don't have abilities, it's like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. It isn't going to fit. God determined what our purpose is, and He created us with that purpose in mind. That purpose is compatible with our strengths and abilities. We can know it and we can choose it. And God encourages us to choose His path. Our sermon text for today is really found in Ephesians chapter 5. I've kind of been setting the stage for that. We'll begin in verse 15, which says, "Be very careful how you live, not as unwise, but as wise." God's path is the wise choice for us to make. In Ellicott's commentary about this scripture verse we just read, he wrote, "In the Bible, wisdom means the knowledge of the purpose of life." And so we are wise if we understand the purpose of life and we choose that. That's the way the book of Proverbs uses the concept of wisdom. The wise person in Proverbs is the one who knows God's will and chooses it. While on the other hand, the fool is the person who either cannot discern God's will or maybe can discern it but then chooses not to accept it, but goes on their own path instead. Jesus used that concept of wisdom in a very similar way. You probably remember the parable He told about two builders. One was wise and one was foolish. The wise man built his house on stone, a solid foundation. The foolish man built his house on sand. And when the torrents of nature's weather came and rose up against those two houses, nature itself proved which builder was wise and which one was foolish. And then after telling that parable, Jesus applied it to us with these words: "He who hears my words and puts them into practice is wise." In other words, Jesus said, the wise person is the one who knows God's plan for him, who knows God's will, who knows God's path, and then chooses to take that path. That's exactly what Paul is trying to teach us in our text in Ephesians 5. That's why he wrote these words in verse 17 of that chapter. "Do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is." The wise person will discern God's will, will choose, recognize, and then choose God's path. Many people, by that definition in our world, are foolish. They do not discern that there is any real meaning to life. They do not discern that there is any divine purpose for their life. Forrest Gump wrestled with that question. Do you remember the scene in that famous movie? Throughout the movie, Forrest continually tried to build a relationship with his one true love, a girl named Jenny. She drifted in and out of his life at her convenience. He seemed to always show up at just the right moment in a time of crisis to rescue her, but she never returned his love until she was diagnosed with a terminal illness. And then she turned to him. They were quickly married, and Forrest was so happy. But their life together and his happiness were short-lived, for soon afterwards Jenny died. Standing at her graveside, Forrest wondered, I don't know if Mama was right or if it's Lieutenant Dan. I don't know if we all have a destiny or if we just float around accidental like a feather on a breeze. Many people in our world have that feather on a breeze philosophy. They just float around through life without much meaning without much thought as to whether or not there is a meaning to it, or if they have some purpose in life. And maybe we shouldn't be too harsh in blaming them, for after all, they were raised in a culture which taught that they are the result of evolution. They came from nothing and they are going to nothing, and so they conclude that everything in between must also be nothing. But Ecclesiastes 3 tells us that God has set eternity in the hearts of men. That is, that God has given us an inner revelation which tells us that there has to be something more than just merely surviving day to day throughout the years we spend in this world. And that there has to be someone greater than we ourselves who brought all of this into being and holds a destiny for us in his hands. And that there must be some purpose that we serve while we are making our way toward that destiny. God has set that revelation in our hearts. We have the wisdom, therefore, to know that there is a best path. Choose God's path and live out your God-ordained purpose. And make the most of your God-given life. That's the second thing that Paul teaches us in our sermon text for this morning. As we look at Ephesians 5, this time verse 16. Make the best use of your time because the times are evil. He's teaching us here to prioritize our life. Prioritize our life according to God's plan. Make best use of your time, Paul tells us, in a context of understanding what God's will is and then choosing that will for ourselves. Many of us are so busy filling our lives with so much activity. We run from one place to another and from one event to another, and we are fatiguing ourselves continually at a frantic pace trying to do it all. We do this back burner, front burner thing, right? You know what that is. When you have several priorities, you determine which ones are most important to you at the moment, which ones need your attention, and you put them on the front burner, and you push everything else to the back burner, and you're going to deal with that at a later time when you have more time. When we're doing that front burner, back burner thing, shuffling our priorities around continuously, often it is that spiritual loyalties get shuffled to a lower priority. And the focus of our attention centers on things that are actually of lesser importance. And when that happens, we have chosen the wrong path. Maybe we've chosen the path of personal achievement over the path of spiritual loyalties. Or maybe we've chosen the path of enjoyment or adventure, or the path of accumulation of wealth and things, or maybe the path of personal happiness. And God's path for our life gets neglected. Make the most of your time on earth, Paul wrote. And he wrote that in the context of making the wise choice of choosing God's will, God's path for us. There is a good reason for prioritizing our life in that way, maximizing our time according to spiritual values. Let's go back to verse 16 again, and this time focus on the italicized words. Make the best use of your time because the times are evil. These times are evil. We can look around and see that, can't we? There is so much godlessness, so much crime at even the highest levels of our government, so much violence in our cities, so much danger on our streets, so much hurt that goes on between one person and another, so much suffering at the hands of others. If there ever were times that society need called back to God's path, these are those times. And so Paul directed us. In a parallel letter that he wrote, teaching the same thing to the Christians in the city of Colossae, Paul directed us to be instrumental in being an influence on our world for the right priorities, the spiritual priorities. And so he wrote this in Colossians 4, verses 5 and 6. Walk in wisdom toward unbelievers, making the best use of your time. Let your conversation be gracious and attractive so that you will have the right response for everyone. As you seek God's path and walk down that, be prepared to declare His praises. Give testimony to who He is. Be a witness for the wisdom of choosing His path. Be a light in a dark world. Every day of life is a gift from God. But the way we live that life is our gift to Him, fulfilling His purpose in our life. Some years ago, a survey was taken among a group of nonagenarians, people who were in their 90s. They were asked, if you had to live your life over again, what would you do differently? I think that's a great question to ask people who are at the end stages of their life. They had already lived through the impetuous years of their 20s, and they'd already lived through the busy child-raising years of their 30s and 40s, and the career-peaking years in their 50s, and the retirement enjoyment years of their 60s and 70s. And now in their 90s, they were able to look back over all of it and make an objective assessment. And so when they were asked, what would you do differently if you had your life to live it over again? One of the top answers given was this: I would do something with my life. Something that succeeds me. Something that makes a lasting difference. That's exactly what Paul called us to. To choose God's path and to be His witnesses in this world that so needs His wisdom. Let's be that person. Let's make a difference for God. Let's choose His path for our lives, using our time by fulfilling the purpose He has given us. I challenge you to pray the words of Psalm 90:12, which say, teach us to consider our mortality so that we might live wisely. Our days are numbered. Make the wisest choice. Choose God's path. For those of you who are Christians and maybe have been floundering, wondering, what am I doing in my Christian life? What's church all about Sunday after Sunday? Is that all there is to it? No, it is not. God has a purpose for you. Live out that purpose. For those of you who have never begun to walk the path that God has laid out for you, it's real easy to identify what it is. It's the path that leads to the cross. It's the path that leads to the Savior who bled on that cross. It's the path that leads you to fall down before Him and ask for the forgiveness of your sins and to begin the journey toward eternity. That's the path that God has laid out for you. And He invites you to take the first step on that journey today. And so if you would like to take that journey, begin by walking down this aisle, confessing Him as God, accepting Jesus as Savior. Come as we stand and sing our invitation hymn together.